Hello everyone, my name is Mohammed Adam and I'm a captain on the Q400 aircraft. In this presentation, I would like to discuss with you in simplest terms the different aircraft weights that we as pilots face in our daily operations. There are many useful videos on this platform that explain the same, and everyone has got their own way of calculating certain weight values, and it is recommended that you even look at those to get a better insight on how the performance works when we consider the different aircraft weights. Do subscribe to this channel if you find it useful, so that I can make a series of videos on many other aspects that we face in our daily operations. As I get them, as I learn them, and I would love to share them with you on what I have learned, so that we are all informed in our own ways. Thank you very much, and enjoy the presentation. The ramp weight of an aircraft is the weight that it has just as it has been loaded and ready to move. Ramp is another name for the apron. And the ramp weight comprises of the takeoff weight, which you will see in the next presentation, the operating empty weight or the dry operating weight, and the empty weight of the aircraft. The operating empty weight is basically the weight of the crew and the baggage, including the aircraft's components, which would be the unusable fuel, oil, hydraulic fluid, and the other components that make up the aircraft. The empty weight is just basically the weight of the structure, the fuselage, the engines, and everything, excluding all the components that are installed for the passenger comfort and the like. More definitions on these can be obtained from suitable sites that you will be able to access. Every time these presentations will be given to you, you will read one part in red at the bottom which says not to exceed the maximum certified, which means that the manufacturer has laid down a particular value for each of these weights not to be exceeded for obvious reasons. So we do not exceed the value as stated in the manuals for each of these weights. Let's move on now to discuss the takeoff weight of the aircraft. Next in line is the takeoff weight, and it is made up of the sum of the zero fuel weight plus the takeoff fuel. You will see in the upcoming slide what the zero fuel it is made up of, and when you add the takeoff fuel to the zero fuel weight, you will get the takeoff weight, which is basically the weight of the aircraft with which it can take off, respecting all the performance limitations of the area around the aircraft, the airport, the weather, as well as the aircraft's structural limitations. And again, for obvious reasons, we do not exceed the takeoff weight, maximum takeoff weight, as stated by the manufacturer, simply because the aircraft may not be able to take off at all, or if it does so, you will compromise safety in terms of climb performance and structural limitations. So we always have to respect the limits as laid down by the manufacturer. Let's move on now and talk of the next slide, which will be the zero fuel weight. Now we come to the zero fuel weight, and in simple terms, this is everything in the aircraft without the usable fuel. I'll say it again, everything in the aircraft without usable fuel. So you can have the crew, or you'll have the crew, the passengers, the cargo. Unusable fuel is basically the fuel that remains in the tanks, but you cannot use it for operations. So there will always be some residual amount remaining, which you cannot use. Then there is the oil, the hydraulic fluids, and cabin equipment, and everything else that makes up the aircraft, but without the usable fuel. That's why it says a zero fuel. A calculation that can be done on this one is basically to add the total traffic load, which you'll see in the upcoming slide, total traffic load, and the dry operating weight of the aircraft, which I'll explain in the following slides. So let's now move on and talk of the landing weight, then we'll get back to what we've just discussed about in a bit more detail. The landing weight is basically the weight with which the aircraft is expected to land, and for obvious reasons we do not want to exceed the maximum landing weight as stated by the manufacturer unless it's an emergency. In certain emergencies where we take off and we have an abnormal situation, we'd like to come back and land, we may land with more than that which the manufacturer has actually prescribed. So these are special cases that we can't do much about, and they are procedures that we take into account when we do such maneuvers. However, in normal operations, the landing weight is simply the takeoff weight less the trip fuel. So it's working backwards. So if I want to land with a particular landing weight, I'll have to add to that maximum landing weight the trip fuel, because when I then subtract the takeoff fuel, which I'll get by adding the two, I will get the landing weight. So normally in flying, we often work backwards. We look at what we need ahead of us, and then we work from there backwards by adding. This is a very important little skill that I have come across, and obviously as experienced pilots will tell you that working backwards sometimes really helps in many things. For example, top of descent calculations and the like. So you take off with a particular weight, all right, which obviously should not exceed your maximum takeoff weight. If you take away fuel, the one you burn, the trip fuel, is a burn off, you call it, then you end up getting the maximum, or rather the landing weight. Can be the maximum or can be less than that. It's very important. And again, we cannot land with more than the maximum landing weight unless it's a special case. We now come to a very important and sometimes it's very less understood topic, what we call the regulated takeoff weight, RTOW, or some people call it the regulatory takeoff weight. In simple terms, this can be calculated in two ways. There are many other ways, as I keep saying, that different pilots and different aviators, experienced people, will have their own ways of explaining to you about this. One of the ways is to use tables and charts from the aircraft manuals, and that can be a very, very lengthy and tedious process. The simplest way for you to know what the regulated takeoff weight is simply the weight which you should be able to land safely, keeping all the limitations within their boundaries. Now, the maximum landing weight that is given by the manufacturer is what you can land with until that amount, not more than that amount. So if we take that value and we add the trip fuel to that value for that particular trip, for the particular sector, we will get a value called the regulated takeoff weight, which will be pretty much nearer the tables and the charts that you may use, which take into account of all the factors that contribute towards the RTOW calculations, which I have actually listed a few of them in the next slide. Now, when you take the maximum landing weight and you add the trip fuel, you get another takeoff weight. If this takeoff weight is less than the maximum certified by the manufacturer, you will use that as your RTOW, as a takeoff weight with which you can take off the aircraft. However, you may need to go less depending on the conditions on that day. If you get a value more than the maximum takeoff weight after doing this calculation, then your RTOW should just be the maximum certified by the manufacturer. Please make sure you understand this, as we will be doing examples in following presentations after I have described to you all these different types of weights. I hope this makes sense. Okay guys, moving on now to the factors that affect the regulated takeoff weight. Of course, we will not go in depth because of time of the other presentations, and I would really encourage you to go and read especially the aircraft performance notes on any suitable ATPL area or book that will give you an in-depth analysis on most of this performance that we are about to talk here. But just to give you a bit of an insight and a bit of a basic understanding, RTOW is, as I said, a takeoff weight which has been regulated to take into account many factors that affect the aircraft performance. Remember, we have the maximum takeoff weight as laid down by the manufacturer, which we can use until that amount of weight for the aircraft to safely take off. But we normally cannot always expect to use a maximum weight of the aircraft for takeoff for many reasons. And these reasons are some of them which I've just listed them down on this particular slide. So for example, aircraft structural limits, can be compromised if you take off with a weight which is way more than the maximum certified, or sometimes even if it's the maximum certified itself, depending on the other situations and conditions around the aircraft. Runway length, slope, surface conditions. The longer the runway, the faster you can travel, the more speed you can get if it's a high speed that you need to take off. And so you can take off more weight. You can take off with more weight if you have a longer runway as opposed to a shorter runway. Slope, if it's a downward slope, you'll be able to easily reach the rotation speed. If it's an upward slope, it may take time to reach rotation speed. Surface conditions like contamination, icing conditions, and the like also play a part in how much you can carry. So it's all to do with how much can I carry, and is it safe for me to carry this amount. Wind, if it's a headwind, you'll be airborne sooner. If it's tailwind, you'll be airborne later, and that also plays a part in your runway distance as well, a length of the runway. Okay, so if you have a short runway with a tailwind, you don't want to take off. I don't think that's a good idea. Pressure altitude, the higher you are, the less the performance, because the less dense the air, so the engines cannot perform very well when the air is thin as opposed to when it's at sea level. High temperatures also affect performance adversely as compared to lower temperatures. Icing is quite a threat. You don't want to have your aircraft unclean. It's better to de-ice it, and if it's iced and then you are heavy, you know what the consequence can be. Obstacles are a very important aspect. At certain airports, you have obstacles like hills, trees, just at the end of the takeoff runway, and for you to clear them, you need to know how much you're going to carry, how heavy you will be, depending on the runway length and the temperature and the wind, and so many things are used all in conjunction in order for you to determine whether am I safe to take off with this particular weight. That's why we always calculate a regulated takeoff weight, regulated for these particular conditions. Okay, flaps, a higher flap setting, you may reach the lift-off speed earlier, you lift off quicker as compared to a lower flap setting. Bleed selection, meaning that if you have your bleeds off, normally for takeoff, which is normally the practice in commercial airliners, you're going to give your engines more power to use rather than draining power from them through the use of bleed air. Okay. Second segment climb performance, all right, is also affected depending on how heavy or light you are. So I'd like you to go and make yourself comfortable with an in-depth reading on each of these factors. Is very interesting, which will make you always be safe in as how much you can carry. It is not always true to carry the maximum always. You cannot do that. Sometimes you have to limit yourself depending on where you're taking off from and all the conditions around the aircraft in terms of weather and the aerodrome itself and the aircraft structural limitations itself. I hope that makes sense as now what RTOW actually means and how quickly you can calculate it as shown in the previous slide. Let's move on now to another slide, another presentation on total traffic load. The total traffic load is basically how much weight is carried as for the baggages, the passengers and their hand luggage. On load sheets you will actually read this type of line called the total traffic load. I will actually attach a picture of a load sheet later on when we do some examples on all these calculations that we will be discussing, we have discussed and will be discussing about. So basically it's as simple as just the weight of all the items in the cargo and baggage compartments and also in the cabin. And these are all averages. It's not that the passengers are told to stand on a scale when they're checking in to get individual weights. That's not very practical, but every airline takes an average of a passenger in combination with the weight that passenger will carry, the extra weight like the baggage and the hand baggage, and then they just make an average of that particular value. So normally normal values are between 75 to 85 kilograms, and anything in between here many airlines use. Some people use 100 kilograms. In the company I work, we use 100 kilograms as an average passenger weight. It's not the person's weight, no, but it includes the person's weight, let's say 80 kilograms of him or herself, and 20 kilograms of the baggage, or 70 kilograms of him or herself and 30 kilograms of the baggage. So it's just a ballpark figure that allows us to use in terms of calculating the zero fuel weight and the block fuel and the RTOW, which you will see coming up in a moment. So in order for you to fly, you need fuel. And this is where the block fuel concept comes in. Block fuel meaning simply the fuel that you have on the blocks. The blocks we are talking about here are the chocks which are attached to the tires, the landing gear, when the aircraft is on the ramp. So block fuel, what is it? Exactly, it's just the fuel that you need to uplift. And as always, I've been saying that people have different ways of calculating many values, the same values in different ways rather. So here's one way of calculating how much fuel you can take. You'll take the dry operating weight and then you'll add it to the number of passengers you are carrying times the average passenger weight. As I said previously, in my airline we use so when you multiply the passenger total by 100, it gives you the total passenger weight. And remember, it's just the weight of the passenger and the baggages they're carrying. So when you add the two, dry operating weight plus what is in the brackets, you'll get what you call the zero fuel weight, because that's every single thing of the aircraft and what it's carrying besides the fuel to carry. Now you want to know how much you're going to uplift. meaning how much the fuel bowser will put in the tanks. And to do that, you will work out the RTOW as explained in the previous slide on RTOW, which is the maximum landing weight plus a trip fuel, and you subtract the zero fuel weight from this value. That's going to give you how much fuel you can actually carry. Okay, now you can get various values here. You will get a value which will be more than the block fuel. Okay, sorry, more than the maximum fuel rather, or less than the maximum fuel you can take, because the tanks also have a capacity. So if you get a value which is less than the maximum allowable fuel you can take, then you can either tanker, okay, meaning that you can go to the maximum value, okay, to save company costs. Maybe there's a place where fuel is cheaper than other places, or you can just take that particular amount of fuel, also depending on the cost as well. All right, so let's say the maximum fuel in a Q400 is 5,200 kilograms, and after calculations you get, let's say, 4,700. So you can actually take 5,200 if the fuel at that particular station is cheaper than where you are going. That's called tankering. But if it's not, then you can just take that much amount of fuel. And if you get a value more than the maximum allowable fuel, let's say you get 6,000 kilograms and the maximum is 5,020 kilograms, then it's for obvious reasons you can't take 6,000. You can only take up to the maximum. All right, so remember, always respect limits. Very important to respect limits. Don't exceed maximum values. And having said that, we go on to the next slide now, which explains what underload is. Let's move on. The underload is basically the weight that remains after the whole aircraft is prepared now for departure, and it's telling you you still have this much that you can take. That's the underload, under the load. And the underload figure is a limiting value, meaning it's a lowest value of 3 calculations. As you can see on the slide, the first, second, and third, they all start with the maxima, which are the manufacturer stated values. Subtract the actuals, as in how we have been discussing how to calculate the actual zero fuel weight, the actual takeoff weight, meaning the RTOW, and the actual landing weight. So when you do these calculations, the lowest value will be the underload, because you can't go less than that. You can't take the highest or intermediate, because you can still go lower. So the lowest is the limiting. When you hear the word limiting, it's the lowest of the 3. And this value will tell you that before any last minute changes occur, LMCs, how much you can take. So now let's say you have an underload of 1,000 kilograms, and now there is a passenger which has to be added, okay, added to the flight. Maybe it was forgotten or something happened. Then you have to look at whether you will exceed the underload or you will still be within the underload. All right, if you are within the underload, you are fine. If you exceed the underload, you don't want to go that far. And normally people, when they have underloads, they can take more fuel, which makes sense. Okay, so if you have taken a certain amount of fuel in your initial calculations for the block fuel, and you say, okay, the underload shows me I can still take a bit more, and if you can manage performance wise and cost wise, then you can definitely cater the underload for extra fuel if it doesn't harm your operations in terms of exceeding the maximum. I hope that makes sense in simple terms. And the next slide now we will talk about is simply the average passenger weight that can be calculated quickly for LMC calculations. Let's move on. Okay, average passenger weight. Average means the combined weights, like the weight of the person himself and all the baggages he or she is carrying. When you add them, divide by how many they are as an average, it's a simple mathematical concept. So if you want to quickly work out how much each passenger weighs on average on a particular flight, you will look at your load sheet and you'll get the values for load in the compartments and the passenger cabin bag weight, and then you divide by number of passengers. That's basically going to give you an average weight. As I mentioned earlier, that it's between 75 and 85 kilograms, but normally rounded to 100 for simplicity. And if we take the higher side, we are more safer. Okay, so we are considering the worst case scenario of being heavy when we are actually not heavy. Okay, so on average this amounts to 100 kilograms for simplicity, and also taking 100 as a worst case to be on the higher side performance wise, even though the actual value would be less, as I've said in the paragraph. So during LMC though, a much nearer value is used, like 75 and 85 kilograms. Okay, and these, as I said earlier, they are fixed by the company, as in how much they want to use as an average weight, but it never goes way more than 100. It's always realistic figures, but something that is manageable in calculations. So this is how you can do a quick LMC manually on your load sheet. If you want to know a nearer figure to the passenger weight, not the 100 is just for simplicity, but if you want to go a bit more closer, you can just make a little calculation and you'll get an average passenger weight. Then you can adjust your zero fuel weight and see whether you have added or subtracted by how much. I hope this is making sense so far. And now we move on to some practical examples.